Joseph. Celina Realuyo, please join us and with your remarks.
Good morning, and thanks again to Congressman Pittenger and to Alejo Campos for the opportunity to speak with you all. And it's a real privilege to be on the panel with Joseph Humar as well as Sarah Paquette. What I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes is really try to bring why we're all here to that strategic level. Why do illicit financial flows present a threat to our national security and prosperity around the world, not just here in Latin America? So let's begin taking a look at the globalization of illicit networks. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the world really became much more globalized. When we're thinking about free trade, commerce, the free flow of people, human capital, financial capital, and also the technology and communications that really revolutionized unprecedented growth, bringing billions of people out of poverty. Unfortunately, we've seen in the last year and a half how the pandemic shows the dark side of globalization. And even before the pandemic, we know that illicit networks, that includes terrorist groups, criminal organizations, and their facilitators, took advantage of this more interconnected and more dependent actual economy to make their money. And this is what we're going to be taking a look at, is how big this economy is. So these crimes have existed since the age of the Romans and the Greeks. But if we take a look at why is it such a big problem now, is that with globalization, the magnitude, the velocity, the wealth, and sadly in this region of the Americas, the violence that continues to plague many countries makes it more unique than other parts of the world that have illicit economies. And just you can see the trillions of dollars that are made from counterfeit goods, drug trafficking, migration, as well as arms. It's all combined. And this is actually why in 2011, the US government changed the name from drug trafficking organizations to transnational criminal organizations in its national security strategy to combat transnational organized crime, recognizing the diversity of activities that these groups were engaged in. What we've also seen is that these groups are taking advantage of the same global supply chains that large commercial, legitimate businesses, whether they be Apple, Coca-Cola, or Walmart, take advantage. And we look at these global supply chains in 4 different perspectives, right? What is going through from point A to point B in terms of material? Who is actually controlling and safeguarding that supply chain? And unfortunately, because of the scourge of corruption, this is one of the areas we find very vulnerable in terms of supply chain management. The money. Who is actually investing? Who owns the different stages of that supply chain? And what mechanisms are being used? We spent a lot of time the last 2 days taking a look at cybersecurity and the cyber realm as a new domain that groups are using for the good and the bad. When we think about different groups, and this is something that we've seen in the case of the United States, we learned a lot over the past 20 years with our engagements, long engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. How these groups, whether they be terrorist or criminal in nature, organize themselves. So we've always traditionally looked at leadership, right? Command and control, decapitating different groups. But we actually expanded our aperture to better understand what are the other critical factors these groups need. First, that environment of corruption, the illicit activities that they depend on. How are they using technology, and how are they managing their logistics? How are they recruiting and retaining their personnel? And how are they arming themselves to use the threat of violence or actual violence to promote their nefarious agendas? What do they all have in common? It's all about the money. Without financing, these groups cannot survive. So we always look at the financing as the oxygen for these groups to maintain their control and expand their activities. So as Joseph mentioned, at the National Defense University, I had the privilege of writing a chapter on this book called Convergence, where it was the first time that we recognized that terrorist groups are getting engaged in criminal activities, and criminal groups, such as the Mexican cartels, are borrowing terrorist tactics in order to promote their different agendas. And as Joseph mentioned, terrorist groups are motivated by political objectives, and criminals are just interested in maximizing their profits. But what do they have in common? Those facilitators. In terms of facilitators, we talk about people who offer safe passage, safe houses, but the financiers are the ones that we're interested in and we're focusing on during this forum. So the convergence of terrorism and crime is manifested throughout the world. Perhaps in the news in the last 5 years, the most illustrative case is that of the Islamic State, or ISIS, in Iraq and Syria and beyond. And we used financial intelligence and financial targets to really dismantle the ISIS network, going after the chief financial officers on the Syrian side, as well as the Iraqi side, which really helped deal the final blow to the physical Islamic State and Caliphate. We still are dealing with almost 20 years in Afghanistan, where the Taliban, the Haqqani network, and the remnants of Al-Qaeda engage in corruption, graft in corruption, but also drug trafficking to sustain themselves. And in Africa, we have the examples of piracy and Al-Shabaab in East Africa, and Boko Haram and human trafficking in the case of Nigeria. And in this hemisphere, we still have the FARC dissidents and the ELN, very active in Colombia and Venezuela, living off of drug trafficking, but even more importantly now, illegal gold mining, as well as the Shining Path in Peru and Hezbollah in the Americas that Joseph just presented on. So the bigger question is, how are we perceiving the way these groups are evolving, especially in the context of the pandemic? We all agree that governments have 4 basic missions, right? To provide security, to promote prosperity, to ensure a sense of society or a rule of law, and then governance, that the government represents the political free will of the people through transparent elections. And all of these different activities, though they're not new, threaten those 4 basic missions, and they feed off of illicit financial flows. So when we think about the convergence of illicit networks in the Americas, I hate to say it and admit that my country, the United States, continues to be the destination country for people and drugs, and we do pretty good exports of arms as well as dirty money. But what's happening now, we can't just talk about North and South, especially with the advent of synthetic drugs. All of the countries in the region are involved in these different flows. And that's why we have to work together in order to overcome and address and detect how these groups are evolving. So as you all know, as Sarah's presentation indicated, we always take a look at how these groups manage their financial flows. How are they raising money? How are they moving their money? Where do they keep their money? And how do they spend their money? For those who don't follow it so closely, in terms of counterterrorism financing operations, the spend area is very important to understand how groups are preparing and scouting out targets through their expenses in order for law enforcement and intelligence agencies to prevent another such 9/11. And as you can see, the difference between terrorist financing and money launderers is, in terms of terrorist financing, they can actually take clean money or money from donors in order to support their organizations, which creates that extra complexity when you're working on terrorist financing, although the methods are the same. And you can see here, you all know what methods they're using, but what's new is the use of the internet and digital currencies. And governments have been slow to build the capacity for us to be able to monitor, detect, and dismantle groups that are using that digital space. Because all the crimes that have been taking place in the physical world are now being copied and mimicked, even expanded in some cases, in cyberspace. So when we think about cyberspace, it helps us each every day, right? We can't actually live without our iPhones or our Androids. But we have to also understand how the evolution of technology, communications, and new applications in the digital space not only help us, but how is it helping what we call the dark side of globalization? So when we think of illicit financial flows, I've spent most of my time in the last 20 years looking at terrorist groups and criminal groups, but we also have to talk about corruption And more importantly, when we define illicit financial flows, we look at tax evasion that deprives countries and capital flight of important funds that could be used for socioeconomic development. So in the past, you all remember that money laundering was considered a white-collar crime or a victimless crime. It's not. We are all the victims because it really damages the legitimate economies that fuel economic growth in all of our countries. The other thing we take a look at are how the funds are actually the product of crimes. Then the third piece is how they use those funds. And there's more interest now in illicit financial flows, especially at the multilateral level, but we have to do something and be more proactive about it. And this is how we categorize the types of illicit financial flows. But unfortunately, many of our jurisdictions are still very slow to update the legal framework in terms of adapting and even anticipating the way illicit actors are using, and then more importantly, moving and hiding their money. So as you all know, perhaps the general public only knows about money laundering and terrorist financing through popular pop culture, through Netflix, and I picked a couple of interesting movies that I've seen. I am guilty of being a viewer of Netflix. The Accountant, which is really about money laundering. The Lord of War, which is about arms trafficking. Taken, which is sadly about human trafficking. And then Narcos. And they even have 2 episodes in Narcos Colombia about how Panama was used by the Cali and Medellin cartel. But what is this doing? This is actually glorifying these groups and giving an image to youth at risk who have a choice to join the dark side or to try to find jobs in the illicit economy. And this is where education plays a very important role as we develop our human capital to fight transnational organized crime and terrorism around the world. So when we think about how we need to better equip ourselves to combat transnational organized crime and illicit networks in the age of the pandemic, I mentioned this yesterday in my chat, thinking about how we expand the role of security forces in the pandemic, taking into consideration that we need to train and equip for the cyber age a lot of those who are front line to protect the security of our countries. The other thing is we have to be better about understanding how these groups are evolving and adapting. They're very nimble and they're very motivated. And this is something that we are always trying to play catch up. And this has been historic in terms of government response. We also need to focus on those areas in terms of youth at risk and strengthen the presence of the legitimate state in all parts of the region. And then more importantly, we have to follow the money. And that's why we're all here. This 2-day forum has really covered many of the different aspects of threat finance, but more importantly, how we can work better individually at the national and the international level. So how do we do that? It starts at that national level. So we've always put this framework together of having a legal framework together, this importance, as Sarah highlighted, of the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in terms of financial regulations and the submission of suspicious transaction reports. And then that very important bridge that is represented by the Financial Intelligence Unit that puts together this intelligence and then creates and develops cases for law enforcement to investigate, and then finally for the judiciary to prosecute. Where are we on this? Since all of our legislatures take a long time to debate and develop new laws, we have to become much more agile and as fast as the illicit networks that are threatening us. And that's what we've seen, these 3 interconnected ways that we could develop a comprehensive program to combat illicit financial flows. First, the idea of detecting, and this is where capacity building and training of your personnel is so important, whether you sit in the private or the public sector. People dread training, but now more than ever, it's so important as the methodologies and typologies change on a day-to-day basis. And then more importantly, it's one thing to open a case, but it's so much more important to prosecute and bring these financial criminals to justice. And through lessons learned of the cases that we've seen, we need to invest in prevention. I know many of you actually represent the private sector, and we need to really kind of couch the concept of compliance and detection and training as an investment as opposed to a cost center. Then we take a look at how we can really focus on curbing financial flows. We need to fight crime and corruption at every level. I still think of corruption as the critical ingredient that allows terrorist groups and criminal groups to thrive. And sadly, it is a scourge in all of our countries at all levels. Then more importantly, we have to more deliberately use financial intelligence to identify and then more importantly, use it as an instrument of national power to dismantle these illicit networks. And as I mentioned before, really trying to expand the way we use laws, updated laws, including more transparency. In the United States, we passed the historic law on beneficial ownership that really removes this issue of anonymity for shell companies, and we hope that other partner nations will do the same. And then lastly, which is actually quite important for Panama itself, is to implement all of the UN conventions and the FATF recommendations to combat money laundering and the financing of terrorism. This afternoon, I understand Minister Pino is going to speak about their initiative here in Panama to deal with asset forfeiture. So that's my favorite instrument in terms of the toolkit in combating illicit financial flows. Since these criminal groups want to maximize their profits, the best way to hurt them, the best way to disable them, is to take their money away and then use that money for development and, more importantly, to reinforce the security apparatus that each country has. And this is something that we've seen throughout Latin America, but around the world, how asset forfeiture, and then more importantly, the return of assets is very important. As you know, both Joseph and I spend a lot of time looking at the case of Venezuela and the stolen assets by the Maduro regime. That's one of the big objectives once democracy is restored to Venezuela, is how to get those assets returned to Venezuela to reconstruct that country. And just as I tried to point out, whether we're fighting terrorist groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or criminal groups like the Mexican cartels and different mafias around the world, we have to do a better job using that financial trail. And we can be complemented now by tremendous technology, such as Bitcoin, to identify who those facilitators are of these groups. Many of these facilitators don't share the ideology. What they're doing is they're a service provider, and they're also in it for the money. And just to kind of reinforce, at the national level, each of our countries needs to really dedicate ourselves to better interagency collaboration, because no one agency has a monopoly on curbing financial flows. And then more importantly, since money has no flag, no nationality, and more importantly is such an enabler of these transnational threats, we need to really reinforce international cooperation. And I applaud the efforts of Congressman Pittenger and Alejo Campos for putting together so many representatives from across the world to spend these 2 days to focus on how we can do a better job at curbing illicit financial flows, and more importantly, in order to promote prosperity and security in both of our countries and all of our countries at the national level, and then more importantly, at the international level. Thank you very much.